For every surplus, there has to be a deficit. If you think about an economy that just has me and you, if I spend more than my income, by accounting identity, you must have spent less than yours. Okay? If we look at the economy we're actually in, because income in the aggregate has to equal spending in the aggregate, it must be true, again, by identity, that all of the surpluses of households, firms, and governments are equal to all the deficits run by other households, businesses, and governments. Okay? So it's very convenient to divide the economy up into sectors. And we can divide them up any way we want. You know, we could have blonde-haired people and red-haired people, and black-haired people and brown-haired people. The deficits of one of those sectors got to be matched by surpluses of the other ones. Okay? That would be a silly division. So what we normally do is we say, let's take the private sector, households and firms taken together. Let's take the government sector, all levels of government taken together. And then let's take the rest of the world, okay? All other countries taken together. Okay? That's a convenient breaking up of our economy. Again, this must hold true. If one of those sectors runs a deficit, at least one of the others must have a surplus. The normal situation for the United States is the private sector taken as a whole runs a surplus, spends less than its income. And that makes sense. Why? Because households generally want to save for the future. They're saving for kids' college education, they're saving to buy a house, they're saving for retirement. So normally the private sector runs a surplus. The government sector, taken as a whole, almost always runs a deficit. Okay, you can go all the way back to 1789. The U.S. government has run a deficit in all periods except for 7 very short periods in which it ran surpluses. All other periods, it's run deficits. Okay? And the federal government deficits are big enough to more than offset the surpluses that are typically run by lower levels of government. Okay? So that's the normal situation for the United States and for most countries. Our rest of world sector runs a surplus against the United States since the days of Ronald Reagan. Okay? You hear about this as a trade deficit. Okay? We run a trade deficit with the rest of the world. More technically, it's the current account deficit. Our current account deficit is offset by the rest of the world's current account surplus. They run a surplus against us. So take these 3 things together, it balances identically. Okay, I can show you a picture. It's a mirror image. The surpluses run by the private sector, as well as by the rest of the world, are matched by the deficits of the U.S. government, okay, since 1983. Before that, we actually ran current account surpluses, but they were pretty small. You could pretty much ignore them. What this means is that it is impossible from accounting for the U.S. private sector to run a surplus and for the U.S. government to run a surplus. Can't happen. Okay? It could only happen if we ran current account surpluses, but we don't, and we're not likely to in the not even the near future, in the foreseeable future. We're not going to run current account surpluses. So if we want our private sector to save, which almost everyone thinks is a good idea, we must have our government running a deficit. Must. As I said, we've only had 7 periods where the U.S. government did not run deficits. The first 6 of those were followed by our only 6 depressions. The 7th was under President Clinton, followed by a severe recession, and then by the global financial collapse. Okay. So not a depression, but bad enough. Deficits are very bad for the US private sector, because we achieve them by having the private sector spend more than its income. For 10 years, the United States, before 2007, for 10 years, the US private sector was spending more than its income, going deeply into debt. Okay? And in my view, this is why we had the collapse. The last time the US private sector ran deficits was in 1929, followed by the Great Depression. Private sector deficits are really hard. They're very destabilizing. So for every surplus, there has to be a deficit. We can think of it this way: the federal government deficit provides the private sector surplus in the United States and in most countries. Some countries run current account surpluses. They are able to run a balanced budget or even a government surplus without having their private sector deficit spending. But countries that either run balanced trade or current account deficits need their government to be running a deficit that provides the saving for the private sector to accumulate net financial assets. Those net financial assets take the form of currency and government bonds.